But in the immediate post-independence, it's divide, loot, divide, decimate, divide, extract, divide. I think ideally I should say amen, and we end the prayer and we go home. In the last 2 days, everything that needed to be said has been said, and I think the two ministers and my brother here have said everything that needs to be said. But as often happens, you know, they say that African preachers are the only people who don't know when to stop when they're finished. So let me, anyway, make some remarks. The greatest challenge to Africa's security remains the dissonance or disconnect between society, which is the generality of the people, the population, wananchi, abaturage, and those people's basic needs, especially their desire for predictable futures, on the one hand, and the actions and inactions of those with the ability, the legitimacy, and the authority to meet the needs of society. Let me repeat. The greatest challenge to African security remains that fundamental disconnect or dissonance between what the people desire and want and aspire for, which is predictable and secure futures, and the actions or inactions of policymakers, of politicians, and others who have the ability, the legitimacy, and the authority to meet or facilitate those needs of society. As a result of the fact that the state, the bureaucracy, and sometimes, yes, the military or securocracy is unable to play this fundamental function of facilitating and guaranteeing security that enables individuals, communities, and citizens to author their own predictable futures. The people whose needs remain unmet are more and more resorting to self-help in order to meet their needs. The gap created by leadership, the gap created by institutions, the gap created by governance is leading people to resort to self-help in order to meet their needs, to secure their futures and the futures of their children. And the state, the African state, that entity with the monopoly over the means of and distribution of violence, has failed to protect, to secure, except sometimes the state is very efficient in repressing expressions of poverty or very efficient in protecting a few elites, especially foreign elites. The state never fails to protect multinational companies each time any of their properties or interests are at stake. But the state sometimes grows amnesia when there is a threat to poor people or the poorest of the people. Which means, colleagues, if we're thinking about insecurity, ultimately, there is now a marketplace for and of the means of violence. And the merchants in that marketplace are drawn from various levels of society, including the global. For example, in some of the countries that are listening to me now, they are now local militias or defense unit. Sometimes we call them some other names. We have gangs that control the extraction of gold, gangs that control the extraction of minerals, gangs that control narcotics, gangs included in the trade and trafficking of women and girls. Whether it's Zamazama in South Africa or Makorokoza in Zimbabwe, or what we are seeing in other parts of the continent. Of course, we have national armies and police and intelligence. It's not always clear who or what they are protecting. This is why this debate happening in the context and presence of security officers is clear. And then I think my brother, Minister Diop, has referred you to the context of Mali, of the Sahel, and it is the context we're seeing in other parts of the continent, including parts of the Great Lakes and parts of the Horn, where private military companies from America, from France, from wherever, and external special forces are present, constantly assuring us that we are insecure and that they have brought security, but constantly unable to deal with the so-called minor problem of our insecurity. So whole governments and foreign money sometimes is pouring into parts of this continent, whether it's in the Sudan or elsewhere. Money is pouring from foreign governments. That money is not solving the extent of violence, it's not solving the insecurity, the forced displacement, but it's pouring. And some of it is being accrued as a debt by the people who are subject of the insecurity. The one thing, though, that as my brother Minister Diop will tell you, even in this period of uncertainty on whether a foreign army's presence and special forces and private military companies was assuring any form of security, the one thing that remained secure was the gold moving out of our countries unprocessed, was the ore, the critical minerals, were things that were being taken. So I constantly really just come to remind, since these are generals, one has to be a respectful civilian and simply say, esteemed members of the security forces and diplomats, stop sleepwalking. Africa's insecurity or is security challenges in Africa, often we are then brought into, I call it a Premier League of pettiness, Minister. You know, they tell you the reason why these people are fighting is because of tribalism, Islam, Christianity, pastoralism, and etc. I say, and they just started fighting some more the minute you discovered gold, the minute you discovered chrome, the minute you discovered cobalt. Somehow, tribalism amongst illiterate and semi-literate people in my country has ratcheted up. Hey, my people, book illiterate, chrome literate. This coincidence does not work well. It's important for us to remember that tech and social media is fueling this marketplace of violence, the marketplace of discontent, through misinformation and disinformation, as you have said, but also through production of content. So in essence, insecurity is highly diffused, whether you're talking at a country level or at a sub-regional or regional level, but also highly interconnected, right? So these violent criminals, whether it's intercommunal violence or internal and cross-border, it's very much interconnected. Which means, and talking to a few generals over tea breaks, everybody appreciates this. Military solutions, guns, bombs, grenades, will not solve as insecurity problem constructed around complex geopolitical, geoeconomic, and also extractivist interests. It essentially means part of what we have seen African militaries do when they were liberation armies, when they became armies, which is the whole of society approach to security, remains the answer. And I liked what you said, Minister Diop. We cannot subcontract or sublet our security to someone else, especially someone else who has an interest in ensuring they are able to get our minerals and our underground water at a price that's affordable or at no price or in exchange for guns and offering security. So we need to understand the society needs better and how society express their needs. I'm always mindful, sir, that when my parents were fighting for the liberation of my country, they were called terrorists. And I'm always mindful when it comes to this naming and labeling, that we don't end up in an overly simplistic concept of everything being terrorism. The greatest terror caused in our country is often by elites in the bureaucracy, in government, and I dare say it, in security, who get into cahoots with foreign interests and are willing to sell their children, great-grandchildren, and grandmothers in exchange for expensive cars, for investments overseas, for little shiny trinket, never factories that produce, never productive economy sectors, but trinkets that distinguish them as natives who did not transcend into understanding economy. I wish to call this what it is. It's not just greed. It's a splendid display of foolishness. Because it seems to me we're exploited on the basis, first, of ignorance. And Minister, you know, very few African countries have satellites. And even when we collectively, and my elder brother, Dr. Kaberuka will tell you this, when there was a desire to actually ensure that you have your own satellites to help you with all sorts of data of intelligence and also gathering, it was torpedoed by some of our own people who said it's too expensive. And yet for us to understand what's happening in our geospatial space, even underground, to know how many or how much minerals we have, we now have to go to those that have the technology. So clearly, how do you do liberation when you depend on funding to do it, you depend on external data to do it, you depend on external expertise to do it, you depend on external technology to do it. I am not saying you should never use external resources and technology. I'm simply saying, if over the next 100 years, there is a desire for a liberated Africa that is truly sovereign, the one terrain of contestation remains: the capacity to produce content and strategic data and have repositories where you can store it. I think it was Dr. Kaberuka in the earlier session who talked about the contest over production of genome data. It has now been discovered that the African gene, or the black gene, possesses a lot of solutions to both current and future global health challenges. So there is a contest over our genes. And we are sitting here, when we ask us where do we invest, we want to build a new parliament building with more seats. We want, come on, people. We can blame colonialism for many things, but I think we need to inspect our own heads. We have high unemployment rates, low productivity rates, we export unbeneficiated goods, we now have accentuated challenges related to poverty and inequality that are dramatized by others who want to exploit us some more, and we, faced with this moment, critical moment of leadership, are asked to decide what is important, and what is important is better cars, better buildings. Our priorities insist, sir, that the challenges of insecurity are leadership related. So let me end by looking at two things, because it's important, three things, right? Colonialism left us with weak institutions, with poor infrastructure, fragmented and divided society, and ideologies of divisionism. Colonialism called it divide and conquer. But in the immediate post-independence, it's divide, loot, divide, decimate, divide, extract, divide, and aid. You create a cyclical dependency, intellectual dependency, economic dependency, political dependency, security dependency. So that when you want to do your own security, you have to go external. When you want to do your own economy, you have to go external. When you want to do your own science, you have to go external. When you want to produce data, you have to go external. Now, tell me something. I am a very proud African, as you know. I have spent the last 30 years preaching Pan-Africanism. Dr. Kaberuka, what is Pan-Africanism without capacity to produce own liberation? What is Pan-Africanism without the capacity to think for yourself, to project the future through science, and etc.? So the arbitrary borders are only a problem, and globalization is only a problem because of the challenge. I want to end by saying, when you talked about cybersecurity, poverty, inequality produces hostility, sometimes hostility even to things that are necessary for one's protection. Let me repeat that. Poverty, inequality, and a sense of exclusion makes people hostile or bandits against their own states, bandits against their own institutions. The outrage that is produced in people who feel excluded. It was the minister yesterday of security said, are we afraid of the youth? Actually, more fundamentally, do we love ourselves and our countries, our young people, and our futures enough for us to say, cyber attacks that we're seeing against government institutions, hackers who are hacking into government critical institutions, and this fact that we remain in, according to the African Union, only 5% of African countries have national cybersecurity strategies that are implemented and funded. Now, the proliferation of cybercrime, Kenya next door, which is one of the most developed in terms of cyber, had a couple of people sit in a room somewhere who had come in, I don't know whether it's tourists or investors, who were busy creaming off 5% from people's accounts. So this identity theft, online fraud, attacking business and threatening government stability. But ultimately, these problems are not unique to us. How do we leverage artificial intelligence? My last point, and I know the chair wants me now to shut up. Insecurity in Africa is a gendered issue. Let me repeat. Insecurity has very fundamental gender dimension. Women hear me talk about, oh, insecurity because of colonialism, because of foreign powers, insecurity because of governance. But many women in Africa face infanticide and sexual and gender-based violence in homes. They face that violence, my brothers, from ourselves. So the insecurity for African women is a multi-layered component. Insecure because they are poor, insecure because of limited levels of education, insecure because some negative cultural practices reinforce it, but insecure because patriarchy, the assumed supremacy that we as males exercise, has essentially meant that even some police officers are guilty of beating up on their women. So I wanted to remind us, gender inequality must be part of the discussion of insecurity so that we are holistic in what we describe.
Now, you raised the important issue of the disconnect between the desires and aspirations of ordinary Africans and the behavior of the people that lead them. Now, as a young student, I was a graduate student during that time when certain forms of governance were being sold to Africa, one of which is competitive multipartism. Now, if we agree that since democracy came back to Africa in the late 1980s, early 90s, that we still have governments where this disconnect between the behavior of people in power and the aspirations of their citizens continue, I think that we have a conundrum that we need to resolve. What kind of governance, what kind of governments do we need to correct this? Now, before you answer this, I was recently in a country led by a monarch, an unelected monarch. And my observations there suggested to me that this is a person who seems to be, or this is a person who leads a government that seems to have its sense of responsibility really well thought out. They seem to do the right thing for their citizens, but they're not elected. Now, in Africa, we have elections, regular elections, but still the governments we elect do not respond to the aspirations of their citizens. What's the answer to this? And I agree with you that this is a cause of insecurity, especially the internal insecurity I mentioned in the form of violent criminality.
The apartheid state in South Africa held free, fair, and regular elections where black people were not really included. This is how black people were included. They were asked amongst themselves in a black voters' roll to hold their own elections. So technically speaking, if you just are ticking boxes of liberal democracy, apartheid, that evil system, racist system, was a democratic system. In Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where I belong or I was born, the Rhodesian government had an A voters roll, B voters roll, multi-parties. White parties contested for power. The tyranny of this lies in this. You will have people go to the extreme and say democracy doesn't work. No, they are talking about a particular type of democracy. Our people have proverbs. Let me give you one in Shona.
Brian, I'm going to have to cut you short.
You want to say that?
I'm driving towards thinking about how you address this situation.
Yeah, I hear you, but first the premise you had used is wrong. So that's why I wanted to debunk it. That if the premise you are using is that we have one system which has performed or not, I'm saying that premise is wrong historically. For me, there is a simple issue. Governance has to be inclusive, it has to be participatory. People have to have a voice. But let me say the Shona proverb that you didn't want to hear. It says, "Mwana asingacheme anofira mbereko." The baby that does not cry dies in the mother's, the crib we used to carry babies on the back. The idea in our society was always you must create the safety valves to hear what abaturaje, to hear what wananchi, to hear what abantu want to say. A governance system that creates accountability and responsibility for those that hold public office with consequences. So it's not enough to elect people, they fool around for 5 years, they steal, there are no consequences in the system. So the unique and fundamental sense of agency that needs to be brought to African governance is that responsibility and accountability are necessary concomitants of power. Otherwise, we can hold power in perpetuity, do not deliver anything for the citizens, are not accountable for how we use public resources, and are not responsible for the consequences of our dalliance with all sorts of external actors.
Okay.
There is a Moroccan proverb that says, let's be like a tree that never changes its roots, but may change its leaves in different seasons. It's important to understand that we have repeated lies about ourselves and lies about development. One of the lies we repeat, by 2050, 75% of Africans are going to be living in urban areas. I want to challenge those of you who claim to be intellectuals. The only reasons why Africans are coming to urban areas is because we have not developed the rural areas. But all foreign capital that's coming to your countries is not investing in your urban areas. It's going to the same rural areas that you have socialized your people to believe they have to leave their land where there are critical minerals, they have to leave that land where there's underground water and come and be what? Homeless in the urban areas, or to be vendors, or to be unemployed. What are they leaving their land to for those who wish to invest in the critical minerals? I would like us to change, first things first. By 2050, 75% of Africa's rural areas, which are also the repositories of critical minerals, of underground water, and of other very valuable assets will be developed for our people to feel no need to move to overcrowded urban areas where there's a stress. Number one. Number two, women in this country have had phenomenal progress as a result of the leadership, the laws, and the policies. Political advancement. But women in this country and elsewhere need, with the partnership of men, to become economically empowered for three reasons. Over 60% of households in Africa now are led by females because men, my brother, many men who are responsible for the children have either died, have either gone overseas, have denied paternity. So we are raising a whole generation of the future leaders of this continent who are accustomed to rejection, to denial, and to no provisioning, right? And the people who are raising them are culturally subjected to violence. They are also politically subjected to violence, and they are socially subjected to violence. We are not doing women's economic empowerment and political empowerment as a favor. We cannot end conflict because anyone who rapes your mother, your sister, your daughter declares war of a cultural, political, spiritual, and social nature. The cyclical nature of grievance transacted in our community must accept. It's because we have transacted war on the bodies of women. Lastly, young people, I do not think that we have the luxury to talk only about youth employment and entrepreneurship. I think we now need to go beyond making agriculture sexy and some of the continent's food security, climate security, the continent's security depends on young people realizing that as this generation on this stage and other older than us die out, they will remain with the land whether agriculture is sexy or not. They will remain with the rivers whether they think it's a place to go or not. You young people, this is not about anyone making this sexy for you. For goodness sake, if you don't take the responsibility now, you will wake up very soon, you will no longer be youth, you will be adults and you won't know what to do. So stop sleepwalking, wake up, this is your continent. No one is going to give it to you, especially not the elderly leadership. You have to grab the future by the scruff of its neck, not through only protest and demonstrations, but through applying yourself with the skills that you have, using new technologies to produce value that makes sure you are not as poor as your grandfathers or as poor as we are. Thank you.
Thank you.